On New Year's night, my uncle tried to pocket the $1 million property, but he forgot who held the deed. On New Year's night, I was sitting alone in my living room, listening to the faint hum of fireworks echoing across the cold air outside. The house felt unusually still, like the silence itself was waiting for something to happen. I had been trying to reset my mind, telling myself a new year meant a new beginning, even if I didn't fully believe it. I remember holding a mug of lukewarm tea when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The vibration felt sharp in the quiet room. At first, I assumed it was another automated holiday message or maybe a friend checking in, but when I saw the caller ID, my stomach tightened in a way I couldn't ignore. It was my parents' lawyer, someone who rarely called unless there was something important. His name carried the weight of the past few years: paperwork, probate hearings, signatures that never seemed to end. Seeing it flash across my screen on a night when most people were celebrating made the room feel heavier. I hesitated before answering, almost hoping the call would stop on its own. But it kept ringing with that steady, insistent tone that made ignoring it impossible. When I finally picked up, his voice came through low and tense, a tone I had learned to pay attention to. He asked if I had a moment, and something in his phrasing made my pulse climb. I could hear faint shuffling in the background, maybe papers being opened. He didn't bother with small talk, which told me this wasn't a courtesy call. He mentioned the property, my parents' land out by the ridge, the one appraised near $1 million, the one that felt more like a piece of family history than an asset. Hearing him bring it up so abruptly made my throat tighten. The lawyer said he had received documents earlier that evening, documents supposedly concerning an ownership update. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then he clarified, choosing his words carefully, that the paperwork listed my uncle as the sole owner. My hands went cold around the phone. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked what kind of documents he meant. He hesitated, then said they looked like transfer forms, forms that required my signature. I felt something sink inside me, a slow, heavy weight that made it difficult to speak. He added that the signatures didn't resemble mine, not even loosely. His tone suggested he had already reviewed them more than once. I stared at the blank television screen across the room, its dark reflection making the space feel even more hollow. The lawyer told me he had attempted to reach my uncle, but received no response. He said the timing of the submission was unusual, almost rushed, and that it didn't follow the process we had previously discussed. His concern pressed into every word. I asked why the paperwork had been sent now on a holiday night, and he admitted he didn't know. The uncertainty stirred a knot in my chest. The weight of the house pressed down on me, every shadow sharper, every sound amplified. He said he would forward the documents so I could review them myself. I thanked him, though the words felt distant. When I hung up the phone, the quiet of the room returned too quickly, almost jarring after hearing his voice. I set the phone down and pressed my palms into my legs, trying to steady myself. The faint crackle of fireworks outside drifted through the window, but instead of feeling celebratory, the sound felt disconnected from the moment. I kept replaying his words, each detail feeling heavier. Sitting there, I felt a slow unease building inside me, not loud or dramatic, but steady, like a thread pulling tight. I didn't reach for the documents right away when the email notification appeared. Instead, I sat in the dim light, breathing slowly, letting the weight of the call settle. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something quieter, a sense that the ground beneath me had shifted. I stayed there for another minute, letting the tea grow cold beside me, before I finally reached for my phone again, ready to see what waited for me. As I lifted the phone, my fingers felt unsteady, as if the weight of the moment had settled into them. The screen's pale glow softened the room, but it didn't calm the pressure building in my chest. I wanted to believe this was a simple mix-up, something that could be cleared with one honest explanation. But the longer I sat there, the more I sensed that this night carried a different kind of truth. Open the email anyway, because avoiding it wouldn't change what was already in motion. Still, I knew I had to look tonight that I grew up believing my family was unusually close, the kind of family that showed up without needing to be asked, the kind that always made room for one more chair at the table. My uncle was at the center of that belief. He had a way of laughing with his whole face, tilting his head back slightly, as if life's troubles could be shaken off with enough warmth. As a kid, I trusted him more than almost anyone. He'd drive me to school when my parents were running late and never complained about the extra time. He'd sit through my awkward school concerts, videotaping every moment with a patience only someone who deeply cared could offer. Those memories shaped the way I saw him well into adulthood. Even after I left home, he remained a steady presence. Holidays felt incomplete without his voice booming through the house. He'd carve the turkey like he'd been elected to do it, offering playful commentary that made the meal feel lighter. I held on to those scenes like quiet proof that family could be a place of safety. But somewhere in the years after my parents passed, the edges of that image began to fray. It wasn't one big moment that changed things. It was subtle shifts, little comments he made about money, questions he asked that didn't quite match the tone of our relationship. He'd bring up practical matters that felt oddly pointed, asking how I was managing the estate or whether I'd considered simplifying things. At first, I chalked it up to him trying to help. Grief changes people, and I assumed he was navigating his own sense of loss. But his behavior carried a different kind of energy, a sharpness that didn't fit the man I remembered. His questions seemed less like concern and more like calculations. There was one Thanksgiving where he lingered in the hallway after dinner, asking about the property in a tone that made my shoulders tense without understanding why. He kept his voice low, as if the subject needed secrecy, though there was nothing sensitive about the land itself. I told him everything was fine, but the way he nodded felt more like he was storing information than offering comfort. He started calling more often, not to catch up but to ask oddly specific questions. Had I updated the insurance? Had I changed the title? Had I thought about renting or selling? Each question was framed casually, but his pauses made the air around them feel heavier. Sometimes he'd visit and walk through my parents' old documents with me, claiming he wanted to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. His habit of lingering over certain papers made me uneasy. He'd run his finger along the margins, scanning dates like he was searching for something. I convinced myself I was imagining it. Grief can make you second-guess the people you love. It can also make you hold on to them more tightly, even when something feels off. I wanted to believe he was just stepping into the role my father once held, a guide, a steadying presence. So I ignored the moments that didn't fit that story. There were other signs, too, ones that seem obvious now. He'd make vague comments about the future, about making sure things end up in the right hands. He'd smile afterward, but his eyes didn't match the curve of his mouth. At the time, I dismissed it as a clumsy attempt to talk about estate planning. Looking back, I can see how gradually the dynamic shifted. He stopped asking how I was and started asking what I was doing with the land. He'd mentioned the rising value of properties in the area, the potential market changes, the pressure of maintaining something so large. His tone had the rhythm of someone building toward something. I remember one afternoon when he showed up unannounced with a folder he said contained useful information. When I opened it later, it was filled with property tax estimates, real estate articles, and blank transfer templates printed from some website. He'd slipped them in between local newsletters as if hiding them in plain sight. Even then, I didn't want to see him as anything other than family. I told myself he was trying to help me understand responsibilities I hadn't asked for. But the sense of unease never fully left. It would settle in the pit of my stomach like a quiet warning I didn't know how to interpret. When I'd bring up memories of my parents, he'd listen, but there was a distance in his eyes. He seemed more interested in what they left behind than who they were. It was subtle, so subtle I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. Still, I kept holding on to the version of him I'd grown up with. The man who recorded my school plays. The man who laughed loudly in crowded rooms. The man who carved the Thanksgiving turkey like it meant something deeper than a holiday tradition. I didn't know then that nostalgia can be a kind of blindness. It can wrap itself around the truth until the truth feels too heavy to lift. When I think back on those early shifts in his behavior, I can see the patterns so clearly it almost feels embarrassing. But at the time, all I felt was the slow, uneasy distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. And I kept telling myself that family didn't change like that. Not really. Not permanently. Not in ways that mattered. But I was wrong. Looking back, the first sign I should have noticed came on a warm afternoon in late summer, months before that New Year's night call. I had been sorting through a stack of mail that had piled up on the kitchen counter, trying to clear out the things I kept putting off. Most of it was junk, catalogs, credit card offers, local coupons. But tucked between two envelopes was a letter addressed to me that didn't look familiar at all. The return address wasn't a company I recognized, and when I opened it, I found a brief notice asking for confirmation of a recent inquiry about the property. The wording was vague, and my name was spelled slightly wrong, like someone had copied it from memory instead of a legal document. At the time, the letter barely registered as anything more than an administrative error. I remember laughing a little under my breath, shaking my head as I tossed it aside. Bureaucratic mistakes were common, and I'd been dealing with enough paperwork since my parents died that I didn't question another small hiccup. Still, something in the letter's tone lingered with me for the rest of the day. It was strangely formal, almost cautious, as if whoever wrote it suspected something wasn't quite right. A week later, another piece of mail arrived, this one addressed to my uncle, but delivered to my house. The envelope was thicker, with an official blue stamp on the front that indicated property-related correspondence. I assumed it was a misdelivery, but when I picked it up, I noticed my address wasn't handwritten. It had been typed. That meant whoever mailed it intentionally sent it to my home, not his. I thought about calling him to let him know, but something stopped me. Instead, I placed the envelope on my desk and told myself I'd drop it off the next time I saw him. That envelope sat there for days. Every time I walked past my desk, I found myself glancing at it, wondering why anything related to property records would be addressed to him but sent to me. I tried to brush away the unease, but it kept creeping back in small, quiet waves. It wasn't suspicion then, just a faint, unsettled feeling I didn't know what to do with. I convinced myself it was nothing. Families share responsibilities. Maybe he was trying to help. Maybe the sender made a mistake. Those were the kinds of explanations I clung to because they were easier than admitting the truth. Something felt off. Then came the moment that truly should have woken me up. I was visiting him one afternoon, just a casual visit, nothing important. We were sitting at his dining table, sipping coffee, talking about upcoming holidays. At some point, his tone shifted slightly, just enough to make me straighten in my chair. He leaned forward with what looked like genuine concern and asked if I had been keeping up with the property taxes. His voice was calm, but there was a tightness underneath that made my stomach flutter. I told him I was managing fine, and he nodded, though not in the relaxed way he usually did. Instead, it was slow, deliberate, like he was measuring my answer. He asked if I'd ever considered letting someone more experienced handle the property paperwork. The air seemed to thin for a moment, and I felt a little lightheaded, unsure why the question made me uneasy. He had never framed things like that before. It didn't sound like concern, it sounded like positioning. When I didn't respond right away, he shifted the subject effortlessly, almost too smoothly, like he realized he had pushed a step too far. On my way home that day, I kept replaying the conversation. The way he looked at me when he asked about taxes. The way he paused after my answer. The way he seemed almost disappointed when I brushed off his offer. I tried to dismiss the thought, telling myself I was overanalyzing. But the image lingered, sitting in the back of my mind like a misplaced puzzle piece I couldn't identify. 2 days later, I received an email from the county office confirming a request for updated ownership documentation. My name was included in the message, but the request itself had been submitted from a different email address, an address that wasn't mine. At first, I thought maybe it was a phishing scam. Then I saw the last name attached to the request. It matched my uncle's. My hands went cold as I read the email twice, then a third time, searching for another explanation. There wasn't one. I emailed the county office back, politely clarifying that I hadn't submitted the request. They acknowledged the correction, but didn't offer any details about the original submission. Something about that missing information made my skin prickle. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, feeling a slow, heavy wave of unease settle into my chest. That was the moment I should have acted. I should have asked questions, pressed for details, paid attention to what my instincts were trying to tell me. Instead, I let it drift to the back of my mind, convincing myself it was a misunderstanding that didn't merit stress. I had no idea then how much that small choice would matter. Still, the feeling never fully left me. It hovered beneath the surface of my thoughts. Subtle but persistent, like the faint hum of something mechanical behind a wall. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet discomfort was the first real sign. A warning I would only understand much later. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to my normal routines, but something about those small incidents kept tugging at the back of my mind. It was like a tiny thread had come loose, and each time I tried to ignore it, it only pulled tighter. I found myself checking the mail more carefully, lingering over envelopes I would have tossed aside before. Even the simple act of hearing the mail slot rattle made my shoulders tense in a way I couldn't fully explain. One morning, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across from my house. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to have guests, but this car seemed to always arrive around the same time, late morning, idling quietly for a few minutes before driving off. The windows were tinted just dark enough that I couldn't see inside. I told myself it was probably nothing, but the rhythm of its visits felt too deliberate, too routine. Around that same time, my uncle started calling more regularly. At first, the conversations felt casual enough, but each call eventually circled back to the same subject, the property. He'd bring it up as if it were an afterthought, a stray concern, but the shift in his tone always betrayed something else. The warmth I grew up associating with him seemed dimmer, replaced by something sharper and more calculated. One afternoon, his call came while I was sorting through a box of my father's old tools in the garage. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, and I remember wiping my hands on a towel before answering. His voice came through the speaker with forced enthusiasm, as if he were trying to cover an urgency he didn't want me to notice. After a few pleasantries, he slipped into questions about whether I had updated anything related to the property recently. The way he phrased it made me pause, noticing a hint of expectation in his voice, as though he believed there was something I should have done already. I told him nothing had changed, and the silence that followed stretched just a little longer than comfortable. He quickly recovered, changing the subject, but the moment left a faint buzzing in my chest. When I hung up, I stood there in the garage for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the neighborhood, trying to understand why his questions felt so different now. A few days later, I went to the county office to deliver documents for an unrelated matter. While I was there, I asked the clerk a casual question about the ownership records on the property. Her response was straightforward, nothing unusual in her tone, but the printed copy she handed me made my stomach twist. There was a notation at the bottom indicating an attempted inquiry under a name very close to my uncle's, though not spelled exactly the same. The date matched the week I'd received the strange email. I thanked her and walked back to my car, the paper folded neatly in my hand. The air outside felt cooler than I expected, and when I sat in the driver's seat, I didn't start the engine right away. Instead, I stared at the folded paper resting on my lap, feeling a low churn in my gut. Something was happening, something I had been too willing to dismiss until now. Later that evening, I pulled out the thick envelope that had arrived at my house weeks earlier, the one addressed to my uncle. I had meant to return it, but now it felt impossible to ignore. I didn't open it, though the urge pressed at me. Instead, I held it in my hands, running my fingers over the embossed seal on the flap. The paper felt heavy, substantial, the kind of envelope that carries information someone considers important. I set it back on my desk, but not in the pile of things to return. Instead, I placed it on the corner where I would notice it every time I walked by. It felt like something I needed to keep in sight until I understood what was really going on. Meanwhile, my uncle's behavior continued to shift. He started stopping by unexpectedly, always with some casual excuse, dropping off leftovers, checking in, sharing something he thought I might find useful. But his eyes wandered around my home in a way that felt different. His attention lingered on my dining table, where I kept my paperwork. He asked vague questions about how I was managing, his tone smooth but edged with curiosity that didn't feel benign. Once, when I stepped into the kitchen to get him a glass of water, I returned to find him standing near my desk, looking at the surface with too much interest. He straightened quickly when he saw me, smiling as if nothing had happened. I forced a smile back, but inside, something tightened, a quiet realization that his presence felt less like family and more like surveillance. The more I paid attention, the more I noticed the small things. He seemed to know when I was home and when I wasn't. He asked about my plans for weekends with unusual enthusiasm. He brought up hypothetical situations that sounded uncomfortably similar to my own circumstances, as if testing my reactions. By the end of that month, the feeling I'd been trying to suppress was no longer subtle. It pressed against me every day, steady and insistent, telling me I needed to pay attention. Something in my uncle's behavior wasn't just different, it was purposeful. And even though I couldn't yet see the full picture, I could feel the outline forming in the shadows. I just didn't know then how far he was preparing to go. The shift in my uncle's behavior became even more noticeable when I started going through old family documents more carefully. It began as an attempt to organize everything I had been avoiding since my parents passed. I pulled out dusty boxes from the closet, stacking them on the living room floor. The smell of old paper and fading ink filled the room, and for a moment, it felt like I was stepping backward into a part of my life I hadn't touched in years. Inside one of the boxes were my parents' handwritten notes, reminders, lists, little messages they left for each other on scraps of paper. Seeing their handwriting made my chest tighten, and I sat quietly for a few minutes, letting the feelings wash over me. I hadn't planned to linger on memories, but grief has a way of appearing in the small details you don't expect. As I sorted through the documents, I began noticing gaps, missing tax forms, missing receipts, even missing photocopies of older deeds. At first, I blamed my own lack of organization. After all, losing things happens, especially when so much paperwork accumulates over time. But the more I combed through the files, the more I realized that certain documents weren't just misplaced, they were the exact ones tied to the property. That realization landed heavily, tightening the air around me. I sat back on the floor, letting the papers rest in my lap, feeling the familiar unease return. It was subtle before, easy to dismiss, but now it felt deliberate. The missing documents weren't random. They formed a pattern I could no longer pretend not to see. Around this time, my uncle's interest in my schedule became strangely consistent. He always seemed to know when I had appointments, when I was working late, or when I planned to visit friends. I never told him these things directly, but he'd mention them casually in conversation, as if he'd just happened to hear them somewhere. I tried to ignore the oddness, telling myself that family sometimes pays more attention than you realize. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what this felt like. This felt like someone collecting information, quietly, steadily, without giving himself away. One evening, I decided to bring up my concerns in a subtle way. We were sitting on my porch, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I mentioned how much work the property had been, and how overwhelming the paperwork felt. Instead of offering sympathy, he leaned forward, almost too quickly, and asked if I had considered transferring some responsibilities to him. His enthusiasm made me pause. It wasn't the enthusiasm of someone wanting to help. It was the eagerness of someone who had been waiting for the subject to come up. His eyes lit in a way that unsettled me, like he was seeing an opportunity. I brushed past his comment, forcing a smile, and told him I was fine handling things. The disappointment on his face was brief, but it was there, almost flickering. After he left that night, I stood on the porch long after his car had disappeared down the road. The cool air pressed against my skin, grounding me in a strange clarity. I replayed the conversation, noticing every shift in his tone, every moment where he leaned in a little too much. Something was happening behind the scenes, something he wasn't ready to say out loud. A few days later, I received another unexpected envelope, this one from a private appraiser. It contained a polite letter thanking me for the preliminary request regarding valuation. The problem was I had never contacted an appraiser. The letter didn't list a sender name, just an office number, but the implication was clear. Someone had asked about the worth of the property, and they had used my name to do it. My stomach dropped as I folded the letter, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. The appraisal request was recent, within the last week, and the timing lined up with the moments my uncle had seemed unusually curious about my availability. I decided to drive to the property the next morning to clear my head. The land looked the same as always. Wide, open, peaceful. The winter air hung crisp and quiet around me as I walked the perimeter, listening to the sound of dry leaves crunching under my boots. It should have been comforting, but instead, I felt a strange disconnect, like someone had been walking these grounds without my knowledge. Near the storage shed, I noticed footprints in the soil, deeper than mine, wider. They trailed around the side of the shed, stopping at the door. The lock was still in place, but it looked old and worn, as if someone had tested it. I crouched down, brushing my fingers lightly over the dirt, feeling a small wave of dread settle into my stomach. I had been here alone in the past week, and these prints weren't mine. When I returned home, I found another voicemail from my uncle. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm, as he mentioned he had been thinking more about the property and wanted to discuss long-term plans. He emphasized the phrase in a way that made my skin crawl. I didn't call him back that night. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the pattern finally started taking shape in my mind. The missing documents, the inquiries I hadn't made, the visits he never explained, the questions about my schedule, it all pointed to something intentional. I wasn't ready to accept what the signs were telling me, but I felt the truth gathering around me, waiting for me to admit what I already knew deep down. Something was moving beneath the surface, and it wasn't accidental. It was late October when I first stumbled across the paper trail I wasn't supposed to find. I had been sifting through the clutter of my desk, trying to make sense of a stack of unopened envelopes, when one letter caught my eye. The envelope wasn't unusual in size or texture, but the sender's name immediately raised my pulse. It was addressed to my uncle, yet it had come to my home. The postmark was recent, and the subject line mentioned the property, though vaguely. My fingers lingered over the paper, hesitant, because I had learned by then that some things are better discovered slowly. When I opened the letter, the first thing I noticed was the careful, almost sterile formatting. It was from a title company, and it referenced documents I had never authorized. A request had been made for updated ownership records, along with a notation that the primary contact was my uncle. My heart thudded, slow and heavy. Something wasn't right. I reread the letter twice, checking my own name and the dates. Nothing matched what I had done. I decided to dig a little deeper, cautiously, knowing that confrontation without facts could backfire. I opened the files my parents had left me, the ones I'd kept meticulously organized after months of sorting. I cross-checked the dates of correspondence with the dates mentioned in the letter. Each document told the same story. Someone had been quietly making moves behind my back. The requests had all been submitted within the last 6 months, right after my uncle's calls became more frequent, right after he had started showing that subtle urgency I could no longer ignore. A week later, another clue appeared. I had received an email from the real estate agent who handled inquiries about the property. She politely asked me to confirm some documents that had been submitted on my behalf. My pulse rose instantly. I hadn't contacted her, hadn't initiated any of this. The sender email was unfamiliar, but the content referenced forms and signatures allegedly signed by me. My fingers trembled slightly as I scrolled through the attachments, the glow from my laptop casting shadows on the walls. The handwriting on the forms wasn't mine. Not even close. I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly, trying to steady the surge of anxiety pressing into my chest. This wasn't just curiosity or overreach. It was deliberate. Someone had been orchestrating a plan while I remained unaware. I replayed my uncle's recent visits, his casual questions, the way he leaned in when I spoke about responsibilities. Each memory now carried a sharper edge, a new meaning that I couldn't ignore. The following day, I called the county office directly. I asked for copies of all recent property requests under my name. The clerk pulled them up without hesitation, and as I scanned each record, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. There were multiple inquiries, requests for appraisals, and even preliminary forms for transferring ownership. Each one listed my uncle as the requesting party or primary contact. My heart sank further when I saw some forms dated weeks before the first suspicious letter had arrived at my home. It became clear that he had been moving quietly, systematically. Each action was calculated to appear routine, like paperwork that anyone could submit in good faith. The legalese and procedural formatting made it easy to dismiss at a glance. I realized I had been blindsided not because I wasn't paying attention, but because the signs had been subtle, buried under layers of official-looking documents and polite language. I spent hours that afternoon organizing the information I had collected. I photocopied emails, scanned forms, and made notes on discrepancies I had found. The process was methodical, almost mechanical, but beneath it, my emotions swirled. Fear, betrayal, and disbelief jostled for dominance. The person I had trusted most in my family had been orchestrating these moves, and I hadn't even known until the trail began to surface by accident. By evening, the weight of realization pressed into my chest. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The room felt colder than usual, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Shadows from the lamp stretched across the walls, twisting slightly with the breeze from the cracked window. I thought about every call, every visit, every small interaction that now seemed designed to gauge my awareness. The pattern was undeniable. I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself that maybe there was an explanation, that some paperwork had been misfiled, that a clerical error was to blame. But deep down I knew. The care and timing, the repeated inquiries, the deliberate concealment, it was all too precise to be innocent. By the end of that night, I had made a decision. I would watch closely, document everything, and ensure I understood the full scope before taking any action. The quiet dread had settled around me like a second skin, but it also sharpened my focus. Something had begun to move in my uncle's favor, and I was no longer willing to let it continue unnoticed. The first real move of betrayal had been exposed, and now I knew that the next steps were mine to control. A few days after discovering the suspicious letters and emails, I stumbled across something even more unsettling, an email chain between my uncle and a real estate agent I had never spoken to. It wasn't something I was looking for. I was simply trying to organize the documents I had collected, but when I opened my inbox, a forwarded message caught my attention. The subject line read, "Property Ownership Inquiry." My hands grew clammy as I clicked on it, and a low tension settled in my chest that I couldn't shake. The first email in the chain was brief, professional, and neutral in tone. The agent mentioned needing confirmation for a potential transfer and requested documents signed by the primary owner. But what made my stomach drop was that the primary owner listed wasn't me. It was my uncle. The dates indicated that this chain had been active for weeks, with multiple follow-ups and clarifications. Whoever had initiated the conversation had been building the groundwork without my knowledge. I scrolled down to the next messages, which revealed the kind of subtle manipulation that left me breathless. The agent asked for clarification on the signatures, mentioning that they appeared different from the ones on file. My uncle's responses were polite, measured, almost casual, assuring the agent that everything was in order and that documentation would be forthcoming. The language was careful, calculated. It wasn't urgent or reckless. It was precise, almost predatory. I leaned back in my chair and ran a hand over my face. The lamp in the corner cast a narrow pool of light, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadow. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized how deliberate these actions had been. Every detail, every word, every delay was orchestrated. My uncle wasn't acting on impulse. He had been planning this quietly for months, while I remained completely unaware. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my mind trying to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the person revealed in these messages. I remembered his easy smile at family gatherings, the way he laughed loudly and helped me with school projects, the way he had always seemed like a safe harbor. Now those memories felt distant, like a mask that had slipped to reveal something darker beneath. I printed the email chain and placed it on the corner of my desk. The paper felt heavier than its weight should allow, laden with implication. I studied each line carefully, tracing the progression of the conversation. The agent had requested verification multiple times, and each time my uncle had responded as though everything was routine. But routine, in this case, was deceit carefully disguised. My hands shook slightly as I realized that the chain wasn't the only evidence. There were attachments, forms, preliminary transfer documents, letters intended for the county office. The signatures weren't mine. Not even close. My chest tightened as I examined them, the paper crisp under my fingertips, but the reality of what they represented pressing down like lead. Someone I trusted had been quietly positioning themselves to take ownership without my consent. I felt a wave of anger and disbelief, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I couldn't act on emotion alone. I needed evidence, and I had it here in front of me. Every email, every attachment, every calculated word painted a clear picture. My uncle had been working behind my back, testing boundaries and quietly establishing a path to take the property. The more I examined the chain, the more I noticed small patterns. He avoided directly claiming ownership himself, instead framing everything as clarifications or routine follow-ups. He seemed to anticipate every potential obstacle, preemptively addressing issues before they could arise. There was a patience in his manipulation, a quiet confidence that made my stomach knot with unease. I spent hours that night going through the chain, cross-referencing dates with the letters I had received and the inquiries I had made. The threads connected in a way that was impossible to ignore. The timeline lined up perfectly with the subtle interactions I had brushed off over the past months, his casual questions about taxes, his visits to my home, his curiosity about my schedule. Each piece now formed a larger, undeniable picture. By the time I set the last printed page down, the room had grown dark, the faint hum of the heater the only sound. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long, quiet breath. My heart was still racing, but the initial shock had begun to settle into focus. I realized that this discovery, uncomfortable and disheartening as it was, also gave me something I hadn't had before: clarity. I knew now that I wasn't imagining the subtle shifts, the small questions, the lingering visits. They had all been part of a deliberate plan. My uncle had been moving behind the scenes, testing how far he could go, quietly gathering momentum for something he hoped I wouldn't notice. And I had noticed. That night, I decided I would not act impulsively, but I would act deliberately. I would collect every document, every email, every shred of evidence. I would track every step he had taken without my knowledge. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control amidst the dread, a quiet determination settling in. The betrayal was real, but it no longer held the power to blind me. The email chain had exposed him, piece by piece, and though the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me, it also gave me direction. I could see the pattern, I could see his strategy, and I knew that from this point forward, I would be the one holding the cards. It was a chilling realization, but it was mine. That New Year's night call from the lawyer was nothing like I had anticipated. I had spent weeks uncovering small signs, tracing suspicious emails, letters, and forms, but nothing prepared me for the clarity that came through that voice. The lawyer's tone was measured, careful, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Every word carried the sense that what I had feared was real, and far worse than I imagined. He told me that the documents submitted by my uncle claimed I had relinquished all ownership rights to the property. I froze, my grip tightening around the mug I hadn't realized I was holding. The familiar warmth of the ceramic burned slightly, though the liquid inside had long cooled. My chest felt heavy, as though each beat had to push against an invisible force pressing down from above. The lawyer explained that the forms listed my uncle as the sole owner, complete with notarized signatures, dates, and submission stamps. But there was a catch. He had noticed discrepancies that made the paperwork questionable. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully said that the signatures did not match mine, and the dates suggested deliberate manipulation. My mind spun, trying to reconcile what I had just heard with the face of the man I had trusted for decades. I could hear faint rustling in the background, the sound of paper shifting, a chair squeaking slightly, as if the lawyer himself were sorting through evidence while he spoke. It added to the weight of the moment, making it feel immediate and pressing. This wasn't a theoretical problem or a misunderstanding. It was active, ongoing, and deliberate. I asked him how this could happen without my knowledge. His answer was sobering. It was easy to create the appearance of legitimacy if you understood the bureaucracy well enough. All it took was careful timing, misdirection, and enough small deceptions to make the process seem routine. My hands shook slightly as I ran them over the smooth surface of the table, trying to process what he was telling me. He told me that my uncle had submitted the paperwork late in the evening, a strategic move that suggested he hoped no one would notice immediately. The lawyer's words felt like a spotlight, illuminating the methodical nature of the plan. Everything, the letters, the emails, the subtle questions about schedules, made sense now. The puzzle pieces fit, forming a picture that was impossible to ignore. The room felt colder suddenly, though the thermostat hadn't changed. I pressed my palms to my knees, trying to slow the pounding of my heart. My mind raced with questions. How long had he been planning this? How much had he prepared in advance? And most importantly, how close had he come to succeeding before I had noticed? The lawyer said he wanted me to review the documents carefully before taking any steps. He offered to forward them immediately, but there was a hesitation in his voice, an implicit warning. This was delicate, and any reaction that was rushed or ill-considered could complicate things further. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I didn't speak at first. I simply held the phone against my ear, letting the gravity of what he said sink in. I thought about every interaction I had with my uncle over the past year. The casual questions about taxes, the sudden curiosity about my plans, the unsolicited advice framed as concern. Every moment now carried a sharper meaning, like shadows stretching in the light. I had been blindsided not by chance, but by calculation. When the lawyer finally sent the documents, I opened them slowly, carefully. Each page felt heavier than the last. The official stamps, the signatures, the precise language, all of it was designed to look legitimate. But the careful attention to detail only reinforced what I already knew. This was deliberate. The subtle signs I had ignored, the unease I had felt in my gut, all pointed to one truth. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, the soft hum of the heater the only sound in the room. The paper documents lay on the table in neat stacks, crisp and intimidating, but also tangible. I felt a strange mixture of fear and clarity. Fear for what might have happened if I hadn't noticed, clarity in knowing that I now had the information I needed to act. The night outside was quiet, the occasional crackle of distant fireworks punctuating the darkness. I let the sound wash over me, grounding myself. My hands were still slightly trembling, but I could feel determination starting to take root. I had proof now. The uncertainty was gone. The betrayal was clear. I set the last page down and let out a slow, steady breath. The dread that had been pressing at my chest softened slightly, replaced by a focused awareness. I knew what I had to do next, even if I didn't yet know every detail. The first real step toward regaining control had begun, and for the first time that night, I felt the faint stirrings of hope amidst the weight of betrayal. Once the initial shock of the lawyer's call had settled, I realized that caution had to be my ally. I couldn't act rashly, not with someone as close and familiar as my uncle involved. The feeling of betrayal was sharp, a low, constant ache in my chest, but I forced myself to sit with it, to let it guide me rather than control me. Every small detail now mattered. Every interaction could reveal a thread I hadn't noticed. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of his behavior. Every phone call, every casual visit, even his offhand comments about family gatherings or the weather carried hidden weight. He had learned to blend his intentions with ordinary conversation, masking the tension behind smiles and laughter. But I could see the subtle cracks now, the pauses that were too long, the questions that were too pointed. My uncle, the person I had trusted implicitly, was no longer predictable. One afternoon, I received another piece of mail from the county office. This time, it was a notice that someone had attempted to request access to certain property documents electronically. The email indicated that the request had been denied due to signature mismatches. My pulse quickened. Someone had tried again, carefully, deliberately, testing boundaries without my knowledge. The pattern was unmistakable. I decided to take a drive to the property itself. Walking the grounds, I could feel the familiarity of the land beneath my feet, but it no longer brought comfort. Instead, it felt like territory being quietly claimed by someone else. The crisp winter air carried the faint scent of pine and earth, but even that natural calm couldn't steady the tension coiling in my stomach. I noticed footprints that weren't mine, small disturbances in the soil, as though someone had been checking the property without permission. Returning home, I found a voicemail from my uncle waiting. His tone was casual, almost joking, as he mentioned the property and my plans for it. But beneath the lightheartedness, there was a subtle probing, a way of testing my reactions without asking anything directly. The voice I had known my whole life now sounded like a weapon, familiar, but sharpened, calculating. Over the next week, the escalation continued. He stopped by more frequently, always with something seemingly insignificant. A baked good, a newspaper clipping about real estate trends, a question about a minor detail of the property. Each visit was innocuous on the surface, but I began to notice a pattern. He was placing himself at the center of my awareness, surrounding me with distractions while quietly pressing forward with his own plans. One evening, I discovered that some of the documents he had submitted had been flagged for review by the county. I realized that if I didn't act soon, he might find a way to correct the discrepancies or submit alternative forms, moving closer to his goal. I felt the weight of urgency press against me. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about control, about trust, about family boundaries being crossed in ways that left invisible scars. I began documenting everything meticulously. Emails, letters, phone calls, visits. Every detail was logged with dates and times. I even noted the subtle behavioral cues, the way he lingered near my desk, the way he asked questions that seemed casual but probed for sensitive information. Each note reinforced the narrative I had been piecing together. The betrayal was real, methodical, and escalating. At night, lying awake, I replayed every interaction I had had with him over the past months. The small gestures, the questions about schedules, the seemingly helpful advice, they all converged into a chilling clarity. I realized I had underestimated him. That familiarity had blinded me to the early signs of manipulation. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. I also began to notice subtle signs that he was aware of my growing vigilance. His tone changed slightly on calls, softer, more careful. His visits seemed timed to coincide with moments when I was busy or distracted. Even his laughter, once boisterous and genuine, carried a hint of calculation, as if he were measuring my reactions against a plan only he could see. By the end of that week, the situation had escalated to a point where I could no longer remain passive. I had uncovered enough evidence to see the full scope of his intentions, and I knew he was aware that I was watching more closely now. The tension between us had shifted from subtle discomfort to an unspoken standoff, each of us aware that the other was maneuvering carefully within invisible boundaries. Sitting at my desk one night, reviewing the documents once again, I felt a cold determination settle in. I wasn't going to be outmaneuvered. The betrayal had been exposed. The signs were clear, and now it was a matter of strategy. Every action I had taken, every detail I had observed, had prepared me for the next steps. The danger was real, but so was my resolve. I took a deep breath and let the silence of the room settle around me. The weight of the situation pressed down, but it also sharpened my focus. I knew the stakes, I understood the method, and I was ready to confront the truth. The escalation had reached a point of no return, and I could feel that the moment of revelation was drawing near. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the tension in my home had become almost unbearable. I could feel it in the air, a thick, quiet pressure that seemed to press against my chest every time the phone rang or the doorbell chimed. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every subtle shift in the day's routine. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed amplified, like it was echoing the unease I carried with me. I had spent the weeks leading up to this moment carefully organizing every document, every email, every piece of evidence that indicated my uncle's intentions. Each stack of paper on my desk was a small fortress of proof, a tangible reminder that I was no longer powerless. Still, the weight of betrayal lingered in the corners of my mind. It was one thing to see the manipulation clearly. It was another to reconcile it with the man I had trusted all my life. That evening, I went about the house as usual, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for myself. The holiday lights outside cast soft reflections across the living room floor, and the faint scent of pine from the artificial tree mingled with the crisp winter air drifting through the slightly open window. Everything looked calm, even inviting, but the calm was deceptive. I could feel the moment approaching, the one that would finally test both my patience and my careful preparations. Around 9 p.m., the lawyer called again. His voice was calm, precise, and tinged with an urgency that made my pulse quicken. He had reviewed the most recent filings and confirmed that my uncle had taken a direct step toward transferring ownership, submitting preliminary paperwork that, if left unchallenged, could have shifted control entirely. The lawyer's words hit me like a cold wind. The timing, the calculation, the sheer audacity. It was almost unimaginable. I felt my hands tremble slightly as I held the phone. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus on the facts rather than the rush of emotions threatening to overtake me. The lawyer outlined what needed to be done: immediate submission of counter-documents, careful verification of my own signatures, and a series of precautionary steps to ensure the property remained securely under my name. Every word felt heavy with responsibility. I knew there was no room for error. As I hung up, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt in my chest, the familiar rhythm of panic and anticipation intertwining. I walked to the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. My uncle stood there, his expression casual, almost cheerful. He held a small gift box in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other, a gesture that seemed designed to disarm me. The contrast between his warm smile and the knowledge of his scheming made my stomach twist. I let him in, careful to maintain a polite distance. The room felt smaller than usual, the shadows of the evening creeping along the walls. I noticed immediately how he lingered near my desk, eyes flicking toward the stacks of papers I had been sorting earlier. He smiled as if nothing were amiss, but there was a subtle calculation in the tilt of his head, the way he shifted his weight. I kept my own posture neutral, letting him think he still had some control over the interaction. We exchanged small talk, talking about family memories, shared meals, and trivial holiday events. Each sentence was measured, each laugh carefully timed. I could sense the underlying tension in the air, a silent contest taking place between us. It was almost theatrical, the way two people can communicate more through implication than direct words. Every glance, every gesture carried weight. Then, almost casually, he mentioned the property, framing it as a discussion for the future. I listened carefully, noting the subtle probing behind his words, the way he tested my reactions without pushing too hard. I answered lightly, offering nothing that could give him insight into the evidence I had gathered. I could feel the quiet satisfaction he seemed to expect, but I remained composed, letting him underestimate how aware I had become. After he left, I walked back to my desk, my heart still pounding. The night outside was crisp and silent, the faint echo of fireworks in the distance marking the approach of the new year. I sat down with the stacks of documents before me, reviewing every page once again. The culmination of months of subtle observation, careful logging, and deliberate attention now felt tangible. I knew that if the moment came, I would be ready. The sense of escalation that had been building over weeks reached a quiet intensity that night. I felt the sting of betrayal deeply, but I also felt the first hint of empowerment. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing, anticipating, and taking control. The slow-burn tension that had dominated my life was finally approaching its turning point. As I glanced at the clock, the hands nearing midnight, I took a deep breath. The night had already revealed enough. The betrayal, the manipulation, the deliberate attempts to undermine me. But with the careful documentation and foresight I had maintained, I was no longer defenseless. The path forward was clear, even if the confrontation hadn't yet occurred. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet of the house envelop me. Outside, the faint sounds of celebration echoed through the neighborhood, distant but present. Inside, the weight of months of discovery pressed gently on my shoulders, a reminder of both the danger I had uncovered and the power I now held. The escalation had reached its apex, and the next steps, though still unseen, were mine to dictate. The morning after New Year's, I woke with a strange mix of exhaustion and alertness. The tension from the previous night lingered, pressing at my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the first week light of winter slide across the quiet street. There was a stillness to the morning, the kind that feels peaceful, but hides something just beneath the surface. I could feel that something had shifted. I went straight to my desk, methodically reviewing every document and email I had gathered. Each page reinforced the reality I had been confronting for weeks. My uncle had been orchestrating a plan, carefully timing every action to avoid detection. The patterns were unmistakable now, and the more I examined them, the more I realized how close he had come to succeeding. My fingers traced the lines of signature after signature, each one a reminder of how precise and patient he had been. Later that afternoon, I received another call from the lawyer. His tone was more urgent than before. He told me that my uncle had submitted an additional inquiry, this time requesting access to updated ownership information for the property. It was subtle, polite on the surface, but deliberate. I felt a chill run through me as I realized he was testing the boundaries once again, seeing how far he could push without consequences. I documented the call immediately, noting the time, the content, and even the subtle cues in the lawyer's voice. It was becoming clear that this escalation was no longer casual, it was active, and it demanded careful strategy. I took a step back and reviewed my own responses over the past weeks, making sure that each move I had made was defensible and deliberate. Every piece of evidence mattered now. Every interaction could tip the balance. By evening, I decided to visit the property in person. The crisp air bit lightly at my cheeks as I walked the familiar paths, now scrutinizing every detail with new awareness. Footprints, signs of minor disturbances in the soil, and even the placement of leaves seemed significant. Each subtle clue became a thread I could pull, a piece of the larger picture of what had been happening behind my back. At the property, I noticed something odd near the shed, a small indentation in the lock area, as if someone had tested it recently. I crouched and examined the mark, pressing my fingertips against the metal. The coldness of the lock seeped into my fingers, a stark reminder of how close the intrusion had come to succeeding. I realized then that he hadn't just been curious, he had been actively maneuvering, taking small steps to assert control. Returning home, I found another message waiting in my inbox. It was from a local appraiser, confirming a valuation request under my uncle's name. The professional tone of the email only heightened the tension. It was subtle, routine on the surface, but the timing and context screamed manipulation. I felt a tightening in my chest, a mix of fear and focused determination. The stakes were higher than ever, and I could feel that my uncle was aware of my growing vigilance. That night, I reviewed my documentation once again, organizing every piece of evidence by date and context. I noted the escalating pattern, the inquiries, the emails, the subtle probing during visits, the way he had attempted to mask his intentions behind casual conversation. Each entry reinforced the same truth. He had been patient, calculating, and relentless. The betrayal cut deeper, knowing the person behind it was family. As the hours passed, I realized that the danger wasn't just in the property itself. It was in the way trust had been eroded, in the knowledge that someone I had counted on could plan and manipulate so methodically. The sense of betrayal settled into my bones, heavy and persistent, but beneath it, a new determination began to take hold. I could no longer afford to let instinct alone guide me. Strategy had to replace fear. I reached for the documents one last time that night, laying them out across my desk like a map. I traced each sequence, each attempt at manipulation, each subtle probe. The clarity was sobering but empowering. I understood now not only the full scope of my uncle's actions, but also the exact steps he had taken to try to wrest control. The pieces were no longer confusing. The puzzle had become a blueprint for both understanding and action. By the time I went to bed, the house was quiet. The distant sounds of early fireworks and neighborhood celebrations drifted in through the window, but they felt removed from the intensity that filled my home. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the day settle, but underneath it, a sense of readiness pulsed steadily. The escalation had reached its peak. I knew that the confrontation, when it came, would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate, measured, and controlled. I fell asleep with one thought firmly in mind: I would not be blindsided. The betrayal had been exposed, the pattern laid bare, and the danger understood. I had the clarity, the evidence, and the focus to act. The next steps would be mine to dictate, and for the first time in months, I felt the quiet power of anticipation rather than fear. The twist came unexpectedly, almost like a door swinging open in a room I thought I knew completely. I had spent months piecing together the evidence, tracing the subtle patterns of my uncle's manipulation, cataloging every email, letter, and visit. I thought I understood the full scope of his plan, that I had mapped out the entire picture. But the call from the lawyer that morning changed everything. He spoke carefully, almost hesitantly, as if weighing each word. "There's something you should know," he said, his tone heavier than usual. He explained that while reviewing the property records, he had uncovered a clause in my parents' original estate documents, something that had been carefully crafted years before, something my uncle could never have anticipated. I leaned forward in my chair, gripping the edge of the desk as the weight of his words began to settle. The clause essentially stated that ownership of the property required verification from the primary inheritor, a title legally held by me. No one else, regardless of paperwork or claims, could override it without my explicit consent. My uncle, for all his careful planning, had overlooked this crucial detail. The documents he had submitted, even with falsified signatures, were legally ineffective. A sense of disbelief washed over me. I had been preparing for confrontation for months, and yet the real leverage was something I hadn't even realized I possessed. I felt a strange mix of relief and fury. Relief because the property was legally secure in my hands, and fury because my uncle had gone to such lengths to manipulate, deceive, and infiltrate my life. I thought about every casual question, every seemingly innocent visit, every careful email he had sent. All of it had been a strategy, meticulously executed, and yet entirely unnecessary against the legal protections my parents had put in place. The lawyer emphasized that while the clause protected me, timing was critical. My uncle's recent submissions could still cause complications if not addressed promptly. There was no room for delay. The longer the paperwork remained unchallenged, the more leverage he could try to gain through intimidation or misdirection. I realized then that my next steps needed to be both swift and deliberate. I spent the morning reviewing the original estate documents, tracing the language of the clause carefully. The specificity of the wording left no room for misinterpretation. My uncle's name appeared in several places, but only as a trustee and secondary advisor, not as someone capable of overriding my legal rights. The clarity was astonishing, considering how close he had come to believing he could maneuver around it. As I processed this revelation, I felt a quiet satisfaction begin to build. Months of vigilance, documentation, and careful observation had not been wasted. Each email I had saved, each visit I had noted, each subtle behavior I had cataloged was now part of a larger picture, a picture that included the legal foundation my parents had laid for me. It wasn't luck. It was preparation, awareness, and persistence that had brought me to this point. Later that afternoon, I received another call from the lawyer, this time with a suggested plan of action. The goal was simple: formally challenge any pending submissions my uncle had made and assert my legal authority. The process was procedural, almost mechanical, but the impact would be profound. With this step, my uncle's attempts to claim the property would be officially nullified, and his leverage, carefully built over months, would collapse. I felt a wave of empowerment as I began drafting the response. Every word was deliberate, each sentence measured to assert my authority while leaving no ambiguity. The months of subtle observation and documentation now fed directly into this process. I referenced dates, emails, and prior inquiries to ensure that any attempt to dispute the action would be easily countered. It was a quiet, controlled form of justice, far removed from confrontation or aggression, yet every bit as effective. That evening, I reflected on the emotional journey that had led to this moment. The anxiety, the fear, the subtle dread that had accompanied every visit, call, and document. All of it had been a slow-burning tension designed to test me. But the revelation of the clause, the legal safeguard my parents had carefully placed, shifted the narrative entirely. What had felt like a desperate struggle against manipulation became an opportunity to reclaim control decisively. I could almost see my uncle's carefully laid plans unraveling in my mind. Every step he had taken, every attempt to test boundaries, every effort to manipulate through subtle psychological pressure, none of it would succeed. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from malice, but from the knowledge that the truth, the law, and careful preparation had aligned in my favor. As the night settled over the house, I leaned back in my chair, letting the glow of the desk lamp cast soft shadows across the documents before me. The twist, the unexpected legal safeguard, had changed everything. What had once been a battle of wits and patience was now firmly under my control. For the first time in months, the weight of fear lifted, replaced by clarity, focus, and a quiet sense of victory. The next morning, the truth revealed itself even more clearly than I had imagined. With the lawyer's guidance, I reviewed the finalized documents, cross-referencing every signature, every date, and every submission my uncle had made. As I read, a mix of disbelief and vindication surged through me. The legal protections my parents had put in place weren't just sufficient, they were airtight. My uncle had maneuvered with precision, but the foundation I held made all his planning irrelevant. I sat at my desk, the morning sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the stacks of papers. Each line I examined carried weight. Each clause confirmed my position. I realized then how meticulously my parents had prepared for every eventuality. They had anticipated human error, greed, and even the possibility of betrayal. And though I had been unaware of these safeguards until now, their foresight had become my shield. The confirmation was subtle but undeniable. Every attempt my uncle had made to manipulate the property ownership was null. The deeds he had tried to claim, the preliminary submissions, even the inquiries disguised as routine paperwork, all of it carried no legal weight. It was as if months of tension, anxiety, and careful observation had led to this single, undeniable moment of clarity. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief, because the property was secure and his attempts had been thwarted. Anger, because of the audacity and deliberation of his plan. And, quietly, satisfaction because I had watched, documented, and persisted, and that vigilance had allowed me to see the truth clearly. Every subtle sign I had noticed, his casual probing, his lingering visits, his carefully timed questions, now felt validated. I had not imagined any of it. Later that day, I called the lawyer again to confirm the next steps. He instructed me to submit formal notifications to the county office, officially asserting my rights and nullifying any recent submissions by my uncle. The process was procedural but significant. By the time the paperwork was filed, any attempt to override my authority would be clearly invalid. I could almost feel the invisible lines of control shifting back to me, subtle yet powerful. While waiting for the confirmation from the county, I reflected on the psychological aspect of the revelation. Months of subtle manipulation had been aimed at testing my awareness, gauging my reactions, and attempting to exhaust my vigilance. Yet, because I had observed carefully, documented meticulously, and remained composed, I was able to turn what had felt like a threat into evidence of my uncle's overreach. The truth, combined with legal clarity, had transformed the balance of power entirely. In the afternoon, I decided to visit the property once more. Walking through the familiar paths, the crisp winter air brushing against my face, I felt a renewed sense of control. The footprints, the slight disturbances, the subtle signs of prior intrusion, All of it now felt like markers of a failed attempt rather than an ongoing threat. I breathed in the cold air, grounding myself in the reality that the property was secure and the plan had been exposed before any irreversible damage could occur. That evening, the lawyer confirmed receipt of the submitted notifications and verification of the ownership status. My uncle's attempts were officially nullified. Every document he had submitted, every signature he had attempted to forge, every inquiry he had made without my knowledge now carried no legal power. The revelation had been comprehensive, leaving no room for further manipulation. I sat quietly in my living room, the faint hum of the heater filling the background. The tension that had dominated the past months had finally lifted. I reflected on the journey, the subtle signs I had ignored at first, the growing suspicion, the careful observation, the documentation, and finally, the discovery of the clause that made all the difference. Each step had contributed to a moment of clarity and control that felt almost surreal after months of anxiety. In that quiet, I allowed myself to acknowledge the reality. My uncle's calculated attempts had been dismantled without confrontation, without aggression, simply through vigilance, patience, and legal truth. The revelation was complete, undeniable, and empowering. I realized then that while betrayal can leave scars, awareness and preparation can transform fear into clarity and manipulation into exposure. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of resolution beginning to settle in. The truth was no longer hidden, the danger no longer looming, and the property and my rights were firmly in my control. The months of tension, observation, and emotional strain had culminated in a decisive moment of clarity and justice, a moment where truth and preparedness had triumphed. After the revelation and the formal nullification of my uncle's attempts, I found myself in a strange, quiet state. The betrayal had been exposed, the danger neutralized, and the legal safeguards firmly in place, yet the emotional weight of everything lingered. I realized that revenge, in its most effective form, didn't need to be dramatic or aggressive. It could be quiet, measured, and precise, an intelligence-driven assertion of control rather than a show of force. I decided to act in a way that would both protect myself and teach my uncle a lesson he couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I subtly rearranged the dynamics of our family interactions, ensuring that he would recognize his position without a single confrontation. Every conversation I had with him, every casual meeting, was carefully considered. I maintained warmth, politeness, and calm composure, letting the knowledge of his failed attempts linger like an invisible weight in the room. The subtle revenge lay in control. I no longer needed to guess his motives or anticipate his next move. I had seen the blueprint of his strategy and nullified it. Now, I simply allowed him to experience the natural consequences of overreach. He would realize slowly that manipulation and deceit had no place when the person he sought to deceive was both prepared and observant. My presence, calm and collected, became the silent message. I also ensured that all necessary paperwork and notifications were finalized, leaving no gaps for him to exploit. Every document was double-checked, every procedure confirmed, and every legal safeguard reinforced. The quiet reinforcement of authority was, in itself, a form of justice. By acting meticulously, I created an environment where my uncle's efforts had no impact and no room to maneuver. The power of preparation had become the ultimate tool. One afternoon, during a family gathering, I noticed him observing me more carefully than usual. There was a slight hesitation in his movements, a subtle pause when speaking, a careful calculation behind his words. I realized he understood, even if only subconsciously, that the game had shifted. He was no longer in control. The balance had tipped. I didn't need to say a word. My composure, combined with the undeniable legal standing, communicated the truth louder than confrontation ever could. I began to feel a sense of peace that had been absent for months. The anxiety, the fear, and the tension had been replaced by a quiet confidence. The property was secure, the betrayal had been exposed, and I had asserted control without resorting to aggression or emotional outbursts. It was a form of revenge that felt intelligent, earned, and dignified, one that relied on evidence, awareness, and timing rather than confrontation or anger. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in the family dynamic. My uncle's attempts at manipulation became less frequent, less bold. He spoke less about the property, asked fewer questions, and seemed to measure his interactions with me more carefully. The quiet, consistent assertion of my authority had reshaped his behavior, teaching a lesson without the need for direct conflict. I also took time to reflect on the emotional journey. Months of observation, anxiety, and careful documentation had led to a profound realization. The most effective form of revenge isn't always dramatic or vengeful. Sometimes it's the slow, methodical demonstration of control and intelligence. By staying calm, vigilant, and precise, I had turned what could have been a devastating betrayal into a moment of empowerment. Walking through the property one afternoon, the crisp winter air filling my lungs, I felt a renewed connection to the space. It wasn't just about the land or the value of the property anymore. It was about reclaiming agency and asserting boundaries. Every footprint, every corner, every small detail was now secure under my watchful care. The quiet revenge had been enacted, not through confrontation, but through deliberate control. As I reviewed the documentation one last time, ensuring that all legal safeguards were intact, I felt a sense of closure. The betrayal that had once threatened to upend my life was now fully exposed and rendered powerless. The subtle changes in my uncle's behavior, the calm authority I maintained, and the undeniable legal foundation all contributed to a resolution that was both satisfying and enduring. I realized, finally, that this quiet form of revenge carried an unexpected benefit. It allowed me to maintain my integrity, preserve family dignity, and reinforce boundaries, all while ensuring that any future attempts at manipulation would be impossible. The lesson had been delivered not through confrontation, but through observation, preparation, and calculated action. In the end, I could sit in the stillness of my home, surrounded by the winter light streaming through the windows, and feel the balance restored. The quiet revenge had been enacted perfectly, with patience and intelligence replacing fear and anger. I had reclaimed control, protected what was rightfully mine, and allowed justice to unfold in its most effective form. By the time the weeks passed after the quiet resolution, I felt a profound sense of closure settling over my life. The tension, the anxiety, and the betrayal that had haunted me for months had finally eased, replaced by a calm certainty. The property was secure, my legal authority reinforced, and my uncle's attempts nullified. But more than that, I had learned something deeper about vigilance, patience, and the quiet power of deliberate action. Sitting in my living room one winter afternoon, I reflected on everything that had happened. The initial discovery of letters and emails, the subtle behavioral cues my uncle had displayed, the careful documentation of each visit and phone call, all of it had built to this moment. The months of quiet observation had felt exhausting at times, even unbearable, but they had ultimately given me the clarity and control I needed. I realized that awareness and preparation were stronger than fear, stronger than manipulation. I also thought about the emotional journey I had endured. The sense of betrayal had cut deeply, but it had forced me to examine the true nature of trust, family dynamics, and personal boundaries. I had discovered that even those closest to us can act in self-interest, sometimes under the guise of care or familiarity. Acknowledging this reality had been painful, but it had also been empowering. By understanding the strategy and intent behind my uncle's actions, I had transformed anxiety into agency. The legal protections my parents had established now felt like more than just documents. They were symbols of foresight, care, and the power of preparation. I understood for the first time how much thought they had put into ensuring that control and accountability could not be easily undermined. The clause that had saved me from my uncle's manipulation became a metaphor for the broader lesson, that planning, vigilance, and patience can safeguard what matters most, even when unseen forces threaten to destabilize it. I began to notice subtle shifts in my own behavior as well. I had learned to observe without paranoia, to question without distrust, and to act with deliberation rather than emotion. I could see how the experience had reshaped my perspective, making me more discerning in relationships, more attentive to subtle signs, and more confident in asserting boundaries. The betrayal had been a painful teacher, but its lessons were enduring. During a family gathering later that month, I noticed my uncle's behavior had changed. His subtle probing, his casual attempts at manipulation, and his lingering questions about the property had all but disappeared. There was a quiet respect, or perhaps caution, in his demeanor. I realized then that the true measure of my quiet revenge had been in its subtlety. I had not confronted him directly, I had not lashed out, but the consequences of his actions were clear to him. The balance of power had shifted, and he knew it. I spent time walking through the property, feeling the crisp winter air, and taking note of every corner and pathway. The land, once a source of anxiety, had become a symbol of regained control. Every tree, every stone, and every shadowed corner now felt secure under my watchful care. It was no longer just property. It was the manifestation of vigilance, patience, and earned authority. Reflecting on the months of tension, I realized that the journey had left me stronger. I had faced betrayal not with anger or recklessness, but with careful observation, documentation, and strategic action. I had transformed fear into focus and manipulation into clarity. The lessons I learned extended beyond property or family conflict. They were lessons about human behavior, personal resilience, and the quiet power of intelligence over impulsivity. I also considered the broader impact on my family. While my uncle's actions had been a betrayal, the resolution had not fractured relationships further. By acting deliberately, calmly, and within legal boundaries, I had protected the property and myself without igniting a destructive confrontation. The family dynamics had shifted, yes, but in a way that preserved dignity, minimized conflict, and ensured that boundaries were respected in the future. In the stillness of my home that evening, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the experience. The fear, anxiety, and tension of months past were replaced by calm and clarity. I had reclaimed control, enforced justice, and learned profound lessons about vigilance, patience, and the quiet effectiveness of deliberate action. The sense of empowerment was subtle, almost invisible, but deeply enduring. I realized finally that the true moral of the experience was about awareness, preparation, and measured response. Betrayal can strike from the closest quarters, but with observation, documentation, and strategic action, it can be countered decisively. The property was safe, my rights were secure, and I had emerged from the ordeal stronger, wiser, and more in command of both my home and my life. Sitting by the window, the winter sun low in the sky, I breathed deeply and let the moment settle. The ordeal was over, the danger neutralized, and the lessons learned would remain with me forever. I understood now that the best revenge is not anger or confrontation, but preparation, vigilance, and the quiet assertion of control. I had reclaimed what was mine, and in doing so, I had grown in ways I never could have anticipated.